Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The interagency process is designed to coordinate decisions across government, but it can also become a choke point for science and technology policy. Understanding where that process breaks down is key to getting ideas into action. And joining me with his observations and recommendations is the Director of Science Policy and Advocacy at the Stand Up for Science Foundation, Cole Donovan. Cole, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me here.
There's been a lot of focus lately on cuts to the federal science agencies, but your argument in a recent paper is that the problem is bigger. It's about how science policy actually gets made. What do you diagnose as the core problem in the policy generating space?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems with how science policy is made in the federal government is really this idea that when you have a new administration coming in, or when you have a group of people who have a lot of bright ideas about how they're going to come in and fix the government, the thing that will oftentimes happen in a new administration is that you'll have a bunch of people crowd in together to try to make this policy. And then the question is, okay, how do those ideas actually get translated into reality, right? And so what will happen is that these people will come in, they might know government process, they might not, but they're operating in an ecosystem where there are a whole lot of players. And so what will happen is the White House will try to create processes by which that information can get distributed throughout the government. And if that isn't effectively managed, then it can become very difficult for those ideas to get translated into reality.
And after a time where the policy mechanism perhaps is disrupted, and as we've seen, science programs have been unfunded, there's a tendency to think that, well, when the next administration comes in, they could just flip the funding switch and everything will go back to where it was. You make the point that that is not true and not how it works. Walk us through that.
Yeah. So what will oftentimes happen is that when a new administration comes in, for one, you'll have a number of different things that are going to be immediately urgent that the new administration is going to need to take care of. So, for instance, when we came in 2021 into the Biden-Harris administration, there was an ongoing global pandemic. In 2008, there was very famously the financial crisis. And then in 2017, when the Trump administration came in, you had a whole bunch of people who had very little government experience who were just trying to figure out what was going on. So a lot of times the immediate focus of an administration goes to whatever that need of the moment is. And very rarely do you have a situation like you did in 2025 where an administration will come in with a dedicated plan for, okay, this is how we're going to go about reorganizing the government and bending it to our will. And I would say that the current administration had that plan, and they were able to implement their ideas very effectively, no matter how destructive those ideas were.
So when you think about that approach, what would you recommend to any incoming administration, regardless of party? There will be a new administration, 3 years from now. How should they think about the interagency process so that it becomes an asset and not a failure point?
So the interagency process is really this thing where a whole bunch of different government agencies come together and they form some form of consensus or idea around what type of policies should actually be implemented. And when that process happens, who owns the process, who decides what its priorities are, who writes the memo at the end that says what everyone is responsible for, that can have an enormous influence on which policies actually get elevated and which ones do not. So at the start of an administration, you'll usually get a memorandum that comes out that describes this process. In the Biden-Harris administration, it was NSM-2, which basically set up the National Security Council and the IPC process. Now, obviously, you will have different parts of the government that also can initiate their own processes, but fundamentally, these memoranda establish the set of rules by which these processes operate and how that information moves up the chain from the implementing authorities and the agencies up to deputies and principals, and then ultimately to the president if it's necessary for the president's signature.
Cole Donovan is the Director of Science Policy and Advocacy for the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Cole, you've said a lot of good ideas never even make it through that process. What stops them?
Basically deciding whether or not the process should even happen. So again, depending on where those process bottlenecks are, whoever owns the primary process mechanisms, that will usually set the direction for what actually happens in the government.
And how much of this is about the system itself versus the people who are inside it?
It's both, really. The people inside it matter probably the most, right? Because, again, their goals and their aspirations for what they want to see happen in the government ultimately sets the tone for what's happening. But if you don't create systems at the start that allow other people to advance their ideas up. Think about the difference between the NATO command structure and, our adversaries in Russia, where things are more centralized. If there are too many centralized systems, that means that certain processes will become inherently bottlenecked, and it can be much more difficult for other people working on other things to do the work they want to do.
So let's bring this back to the realm of science. If you are advising the next presidential administration, what is the first thing you would change about this interagency process, or the first thing you'd want to make sure that they understand about it as they're building their science policy agenda?
Well, so one of the key recommendations in the paper is to take an existing mechanism within the federal government. It's called the National Science and Technology Council, and it's already established under law, and give it the tools that it needs to be able to effectively elevate decisions that relate to science agencies. Given the broad-based destruction that we see across the federal government, it would be good if an organization like the NSTC were able to pull the relevant agencies together, quickly come to decisions, and then be able to tell people with the authority of the president or the highest level officials in science agencies, okay, it's time for you to go forward and you can move.
For people who are in the science space now, how should they work with the system as it is currently behaving to be advancing their scientific priorities?
Within this current government?
Mm-hmm.
That's a hard question. So right now, everything seems to be centralized in the Office of Management and Budget. And I think as we've seen, especially with the recent regulation that was put forward by OMB, they have a pretty fixed plan for what they would like to see done with the government. And it's not clear to me right now that there is a good way for people who are in positions to be able to move big things without the buy-in from OMB.
There are scientists out there maybe in the federal government now, maybe aspiring to senior positions from outside the government in the next administration. What tools would you advise future science policy leaders to put into their kit bag now to increase their probability of success?
Again, I think that it all comes down to organization, making sure that you have a plan for how your policies are going to be implemented, who the key decision makers are going to be, and then what timeline you would want to use in order to be able to get that in, when you have to hit your key milestones.
Lots of people have never had the experience that you have had of working in those central science policy organizations inside the White House. What's really different about that from being in, say, CDC or NIH or one of the other scientific organizations?
I think, again, it's the level of interaction between the other policy councils and the extent to which things can really hit a snag if the people who really control the levers for what decisions go forward and which don't, simply don't have the same sense of urgency around a subject that you do.
Did it change your expectation of what success would look like?
Yes, absolutely. And the second time I came in, I knew very clearly what I would be able to do, and I was able to set goals and achieve my objectives that way. However, they were much less ambitious than my initial goals because I knew exactly what I would be able to do in exactly that amount of time.
So change the world might not be at the top of your accomplishment list?
No, but I can at least start the ball moving downhill.
Cole Donovan is Director of Science Policy and Advocacy for the Stand Up for Science Foundation. Cole, thanks so much for sharing your experience and your observations with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.